Here we go. A newspaper in Egypt reports that Egyptian lawyers have submitted a complaint to the International Criminal Court charging the President of the United States, Barack Hussein Obama, with crimes against humanity. CBN contributing correspondent Raymond Ibrahim is the first to break the story in the U.S. On his blog page at cbnnews.com, he cites the Egyptian newspaper El Watan, which published the complaint against President Obama. The complaint accused the president with being an accessory to the Muslim Brotherhood, which incited violence across Egypt earlier this year. Ibrahim reports that the complaint mentions Obama and several Brotherhood members in name. It adds, quote, Obama cooperated, incited and assisted the armed elements of the Muslim Brotherhood in the commission of crimes against humanity in the Arab Republic of Egypt. CBN News contributor Raymond Ibrahim joins us now by Skype. Raymond, the complaint says the president incited and assisted the Muslim Brotherhood in its crimes. In what way did he do this?
Primarily, the accusation is made that he did it by his funding them monetarily, including with billions of dollars. And in fact, since this time, the plot is thickening, and we can talk about that later. But now there's even information that there's recordings of Morsi talking with Al-Qaeda, and somehow all this is involved with the U.S. and so forth. But back to this particular point, the Al-Qaeda thing is still developing. The main complaint is that he's an accessory in that he, by supporting the Brotherhood, he is supporting whatever they do. And so he gave a lot of money to them, which enabled them. Most people don't know that it's not so much that people love the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but rather the Muslim Brotherhood pays and buys people off, including thugs who go around burning churches, who go around terrorizing, just people like that who will do it just for pay. And so you can see how this money being funneled really through the Obama administration to the Muslim Brotherhood is ultimately manifesting itself in all these crimes against humanity that the Muslim Brotherhood committed in recent months.
And specifically to those crimes, Raymond, they're listed as torture, rape, kidnapping. Give us some examples, specific examples of how the Brotherhood committed these crimes against ordinary citizens.
Certainly. This really started back when Morsi was still president, back in last December. And, people were rising up against him back then in protests and mass demonstrations. And one of the most notable is in front of what's called Ittihadiyya Palace, which is really the palace of the president. There were a lot of protesters there, and it turned out that they got attacked. They were taken to torture rooms, literally. And we have evidence of this in pictures, and tortured, and people were beaten and just sliced up. And this is one of the main well-documented ones, because all the Brotherhood supporters at the time had incited everyone, saying anyone who rises up against Morsi, we're going to do this to him. And that's exactly what they did. And then you fast forward more recently after the ousting of Morsi, and you'll recall there was those sit-ins, or at least that's how they were described by the media, the mainstream media so-called, as sit-ins in Rabaa al-Adawiyya, for example, where you had all the Brotherhood was sitting there. And in fact, after it was cleared and people found out, people were actually killed there, slaughtered. They found mass graves of bodies of people who tried to escape. One man, there's a video of him, pictures of him, they chopped his finger off according to Sharia law because they accused him of stealing. There was the infamous sex fatwa in that context in order to satisfy the men who were holding that ground. They could now have sex, illegal sex, including through rape with women. And all this is documented, and we have it. And so this is, as you can see right there, and just in those little particular anecdotes, various crimes against humanity.
You say in your article one need only look to the fate of Egypt's Christian minority to see numerous examples of crimes against humanity. How did the Muslim Brotherhood target and persecute Christians?
Immediately after the ousting of Morsi, the top Brotherhood leadership, beginning with the general guide, who's really the supreme leader, Mohammed Badia, the top guy, as well as people like Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's like even really the spiritual father of the Muslim Brotherhood, and any other Safwat Higazi. These are names most people are not familiar with, but these are top Brotherhood leaders. They all came up and publicly condemned the Coptic Pope and the Coptic Church, saying that they played a great role in getting Morsi Morsi kicked out. And it's true, the Coptic Church, just like Al-Azhar and so many organizations, were supportive of the people's will and were supportive of the military's movement of getting rid of Morsi. But they were scapegoated because they're the other, they're the infidel, they're the non-Muslim, so they're an easy target. And the Brotherhood did this, and immediately, if you look at the International Criminal Court criteria of what is classified, there's maybe, I don't know, half a dozen or about a dozen categories: persecution of a minority, killing, torture, abduction, sexual abuse. And if you just look at the plight of the Copts since what happened to them, every single one of those categories is easily met. We know up to at least 80 or so churches, some very ancient, have been destroyed and burned and attacked, some transformed into mosques and so forth. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much, people have been dislocated, kicked out of whole villages. They started, the Muslim Brotherhood and supporters were in Upper Egypt, in the remote areas, exacting jizya tax from Christians. Christians are being abducted, held hostage for money, and then sometimes given back, sometimes murdered, including children. And all this is being done in the context of widespread anger at Christians because of the ousting of the Muslim Brotherhood, which, of course, was supported by the Obama administration. And then one final important point is, speaking of money and Obama, so we know he was supportive by giving the Brotherhood money. But now that the Brotherhood has been ousted, what has he done? He's now withheld money from Egypt. So he's punishing now all of Egypt because the Brotherhood, who have done all these things, are out. And he's doing this monetarily, once again, pulling the money out.
And this persecution that you speak of is still going on right now, isn't it?
Most certainly. It's ongoing. And, you know, it's just, I mean, 85 churches. Imagine if, 85 mosques were attacked, how this would be all over the media, and just all these politicians would be condemning it, chief among them Obama. And yet you get nothing but silence, and they're just being scapegoated for the Brotherhood, who is being supported. And a final tie of how we know the Obama administration is so supportive of the Brotherhood is if you look at the actions of top U.S. officials, starting with the ambassador to Egypt, Ann Patterson, who was one of the most hated figures in Egypt because of her so blatantly obvious pro-Brotherhood politics. And she actually, when people were going to revolt in the revolution, she tried to stop the Copts, saying, no, don't go out, and they were the ones who were already suffering. And she tried to get all kinds of other Egyptians not to go out. And then you have John McCain and Lindsey Graham, Hillary Clinton. All these people, by their words and deeds, have shown their support for the Muslim Brotherhood. It's very clear they want them either back in power or at least not being tried. And I believe they don't want them to be tried because a lot of ugly secrets above and beyond what we're discussing will be revealed.
And why did the president align himself with the Muslim Brotherhood in the first place?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is a very old organization. It has its tentacles everywhere. Another new report just came out talking about all the various Muslim Brotherhood operatives in America, including a lot of them are centered around D.C. The accusation is well known that they're Muslim Brotherhood members, sympathizers, and so forth in the White House, all around the government. And so, that's one aspect to it. The other aspect, of course, is just, real politics. And there's this belief that the Muslim Brotherhood is, a strong player. And so the U.S. wants to work with it, wants to support it in order that the Muslim Brotherhood, theoretically gives the U.S. what it wants, which, of course, is ridiculous for anyone to think that it will eventually. I mean, in the short term, it's one thing, but in the long term, the Muslim Brotherhood has a radical Islamic worldview and agenda, which is just as bad for the United States as it is for Copts.
And one thing, having just returned from Egypt a few weeks ago, the anger against the White House, and in particular President Obama, is palpable, not just among Coptic Christians, but also secular Muslims. Can you help us understand why a large segment of the Egyptian society is angry at President Obama? Not necessarily the United States and Americans, but the White House, and in particular this administration.
Well, you're absolutely correct. And the reason this anger is so widespread is because in Egypt, all these things that we're talking about are well known. People there are watching the news or following events. They're seeing the evidence with their own eyes, videotapes and discussions that make unequivocally clear that the Obama administration, has the back of the Muslim Brotherhood, to put it colloquially. And it's hard for Americans to comprehend this because here, based on the so-called mainstream media, you don't know this. You have no idea. You can't begin to imagine that this is going on. So they are feeling it. They are experiencing the repercussions of the Obama administration's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, and they know it's happening. I mean, during the June 30 revolution, they had placards and signs all over the place saying, "Obama, stop supporting terrorism," and things of this nature. And, but your average American, because if they're following the mainstream media, they'll have no clue of any of this.
And in fact, Christians that I spoke to, prominent Christian leaders, put the blame of the attacks on the Christians squarely on the president.
Exactly. Because without him, the Muslim Brotherhood would not have the power or influence that it does. And so you can see he's an accessory. If someone is killing and destroying you and they have influence and they have money and they're able to reach out and mobilize and so forth, then you find out behind them is a president or an entity or whatever that supports them monetarily and politically. Politically, we've seen it simply with the fact that because of this ousting of Morsi, which was in response to up to 40 million Egyptians marching in the streets, which is a popular revolution. Now, the Obama administration is withholding hundreds of millions of dollars. Whereas when Morsi was in power, this man who was Islamizing Egypt and persecuting Christians and so forth, the U.S. was giving him billions of dollars. And now, as I'm saying, another very important development that you're not going to hear anything about or so far in the Western media is this, the Morsi, Ayman Zawahiri Al-Qaeda tie, with evidence of them speaking on the phone, making deals. And in the background is America, and that Morsi is an intermediary with Al-Qaeda.
A final question here. Help us understand for the Christians in Egypt, under the new security apparatus, under the control of the army, are they better off? Should we be concerned about Egypt 1, 2, 3 years down the road with the military still in power?
Well, it really comes down to, what's ideally a democracy, freedom. And see, this is the issue. People aren't understanding. For example, today, Brotherhood's ousted, but you have the Salafis who are very much informing the substance of the Constitution of Egypt, which will immediately, as a lot of Copts are complaining, is inherently discriminatory towards them and other non-Muslims. So, the problem that the Copts are suffering does not begin nor does it end with the Muslim Brotherhood. And now we go into a deeper, more theological, historical topic. But the Muslim Brotherhood is feeding off of it, is exploiting this sort of thing, and is using it to make it worse. So long story short, Egypt and the Copts are better off without the Muslim Brotherhood. They'd be better with the military, which is of course not ideal by any means, but in comparison to what you had, which is basically under the guise of a democracy, an Islamic or an Islamist organization that is enforcing Sharia and the Islamic agenda, then you're better off with the military, at least. And look, Egypt's been run by autocrats and dictators and pharaohs for 5,000 years. So it's okay if we got to wait a couple of years to transition into a true positive secular, democracy, and even if it takes a little longer than it needs to or should.
You talked real quickly about the Salafis and the influence that they have. Just today, there was a report talking about the evangelical leader who is part of the Constitution, writing of the Constitution, threatening to pull out because of this issue of Sharia law and whether Islam will be the principle undergirding the Constitution. Are you concerned that the writing of the Constitution will basically say that Islam is the principal law of the land?
Well, that's what it comes down to. This is the number one concern of not just Copts, by the way, but a lot of ordinary average Egyptians. Nominal Muslims, moderate Muslims, whatever you want to call them. And so it's become a focal point. And again, this also, gives you a bigger picture of the issue, how this does not really begin or end with the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, this is something else. The Salafis are supposedly, they're the Islamists who were kind of good guys because they didn't engage in the violence and the incitement. But by pushing for this sort of, Islam-heavy constitution, that in and of itself is a form of persecution of non-Muslims. And that's what all these groups are aware of, and that's why they're trying to fight it. And so it's very, volatile time, and there's a lot of changes that will be happening in the near future, and it's interesting to see how they'll develop.
Okay, Raymond Ibrahim, sir, thank you so much for bringing this important story to light.
Thank you, George.